Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. There is a particular kind of courage that looks, from the outside, exactly like an ordinary train journey. Agnes Hartley was 67 years old. She had spent 40 years teaching children to read in 3 different schools in London, in classrooms that smelled of chalk and damp wool, and the particular urgency of young minds being asked to do something difficult. She had been, by all professional accounts, an excellent teacher. Her pupils remembered her. Some had written letters of gratitude that she kept in a box on the wardrobe shelf, not because she thought herself deserving of the sentiment, but because she could not bring herself to dispose of the handwriting of children she had known when they were still becoming themselves. She was retired now, had been for 2 years. Her husband Thomas had died 5 years before that, and her daughter lived in Edinburgh, and her son lived in Bristol, and they called on Sundays and meant well. She had a small flat in Islington that she kept in good order and found increasingly insufficient. Not uncomfortable, she was not a woman who permitted discomfort when organization could prevent it. Merely insufficient. A life managed so thoroughly that it had begun to feel, at its edges, managed in the place of lived. Her mother had died the previous winter. In the village of Thornfield, Suffolk, where Agnes had been born and from which she had departed, at 18 years old, to train as a teacher at a college in London, and to which she had not, in the 49 years since, returned. She was returning now, to sort through the cottage, to settle what needed settling, to do the practical and sensible things. This was what she told herself, and her children, and the letting agent who had agreed to hold the cottage empty for a fortnight. The train left Liverpool Street at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning in October. The flat light of the Suffolk fens began to appear outside the window as the city fell away, low and wide, and exactly as she remembered it, the sky enormous, the land patient, the particular quality of Suffolk air already present in some quality of the light even through the glass. Agnes sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at it, and felt, beneath the practical and sensible surface of her intentions, something older and less manageable stirring. She was going home. She had not permitted herself to use that word in 49 years. She used it now, quietly, in the privacy of her own mind, and found that it still fitted precisely, the way a word does when the thing it names has been waiting, without change, for exactly this moment of recognition. The village was smaller than she remembered, and larger than she feared. This was the first thing she thought, stepping off the branch line train at the small station 3 miles from Thornfield, and collecting herself and her case, and beginning the walk she had, after some consideration, declined to replace with the hire of a trap. She wanted to walk. She needed to arrive in her own time, at her own pace, under her own power, as she had arrived nowhere in quite some time. The road from the station ran between fields of stubble and ploughed earth. The harvest done, the land turned over. The particular autumn smell of Suffolk soil that she had carried somewhere in her memory for 49 years, without knowing it was still there. Rooks in the elms, a sky of enormous pale grey, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere ahead. Thornfield in October. She had known it only in summer and winter as a child, the long Suffolk summer evenings and the cold church winters. She had not known it in this autumn amber and grey, and she found it suited the village in a way she had not expected. It wore October well. The main street was familiar in its bones and different in its particulars. The church was unchanged. Norman Tower, Suffolk Flint, the same quiet authority. The public house had been repainted. Several cottages had changed hands. The general shop was where it had always been, though it had a new front. And at the end of the street, set back behind a low flint wall and a stand of horse-chestnut trees, whose conkers had all fallen and whose leaves were going, the village school. Its bell tower was the first thing she saw above the wall. The bell was still there, green with age, hanging in its small open turret above the doorway. A lamp burned in the window, amber in the pale morning. Agnes stopped. She had not, until this moment, remembered the bell. It arrived in her memory with the particular completeness of something that has been perfectly preserved. The sound of it, the exact tone of the old bronze, the specific quality of a school morning 49 years ago, 8 years old, walking up this same street to this same building, the bell calling her in. The key to the cottage was held by Mrs. Bowes at the post office, a small woman of approximately 80, who had been at the post office when Agnes left as a girl and showed every indication of intending to remain there indefinitely. She handed over the key with the particular expression of someone who has been expecting you for 49 years and is pleased, though not entirely surprised, that you have finally arrived. "Your mother's cottage is just as she left it," said Mrs. Bowes. "We aired it out in September. The garden's a bit gone, but that's October. Come back when you need anything." Agnes thanked her and walked the 3 minutes to the cottage and stood at the gate. Number 4, Fen Lane. A Suffolk cottage of the older sort, low-ceilinged, flint and brick, a thatched roof that had been rethatched relatively recently and still had a slightly new quality to its ridge, a front garden of approximately 6 feet, which her mother had kept in summer with lavender and snapdragons, and which was now reduced to the grey bones of summer things. 2 windows downstairs, 2 up, a black door. She opened the gate, old iron, stiff, the same sound it had always made, and went up the path and put the key in the lock and turned it and went in. The cottage smelled of her mother, not of her illness, which had been the last thing and which Agnes had feared. It smelled of the things her mother had been for 70 years before the illness: beeswax and dried lavender and the wood smoke that had accumulated in the plaster over decades and become in some houses not so much a smell as a quality of the air itself. And beneath all of it, faintly, the smell of old paper, books or the remnants of books, or letters, the smell of things written down and kept. Agnes set her case at the foot of the narrow stair and stood in the small front room and breathed it in. The furniture was modest and clean and arranged with the care of someone who has few things and values what they have. a horsehair sofa, 2 wooden chairs, a fireplace of brick, the grate clean and laid ready. On the mantel, a tin clock, a blue and white jug, a photograph of Agnes's father, a photograph of Agnes herself at approximately 12, and one more photograph in a smaller frame of a woman Agnes did not immediately recognize. She took the photograph down and looked at it. The woman was perhaps 35. She sat at a table with a pen in her hand and a paper before her, and she was looking at the camera with an expression of great attention and something that might have been pride. Agnes looked at the photograph for a long moment before she understood that the woman was her mother. She built the fire in the front room grate. It caught easily, and unpacked her case and hung her dresses on the hooks behind the bedroom door, and found the kitchen provisioned, as though some village efficiency had anticipated her arrival. Eggs, potatoes, a half loaf, a tin of tea, a bottle of good milk on the doorstep she had not noticed coming in. She made eggs and toast for supper and ate at the kitchen table in the quiet. The kitchen faced east, and its window looked toward the church and past the church, the fields. Nothing to see now in the October dark, except the shapes of near things lit by the spill of her own lamp. But when she moved to the front room after supper, the front window looked west down Fen Lane, toward the main street, and from here, over the rooftops and between the branches of the horse chestnuts, she could see the light from the school. It was not the solitary lamp she had seen from the street. This was a different light, warmer, fuller, the light of a room where several people were gathered, rather than the working lamp of a single person. It moved slightly, or appeared to, as figures passed before it. It was the light of something still happening, some continued activity in a building she had assumed was empty at this hour. Agnes sat by her fire and looked at the school's light through the bare branches. She had nowhere to be, nothing to manage, no one waiting for her tomorrow. This was still, after 2 years of retirement, a fact she had not quite finished learning to live inside. It felt too large, that absence of requirement, like a room she had not yet decided how to furnish. But the school's light was warm. There were people in it. She watched it for a while before she went to bed and thought about what her mother's expression had been in the photograph. Not pride, exactly, she decided. Concentration. The look of someone in the middle of something difficult and important, attending to it with everything they had. She slept soundly, which surprised her. The Suffolk quiet was a different kind of quiet from the Islington street. It had more weight to it. She met Ruth Carey the following morning. Agnes had gone out after breakfast for no particular purpose, except that the October morning was clear and cold, and she needed to walk. She went down Fen Lane and along the main street, and had stopped at the low flint wall of the school, looking at the building in the full daylight, when a woman came around the side of it, carrying a bucket in one hand and a ring of keys in the other, and very nearly collided with her. "Forgive me," said the woman. "I didn't see you there." "It was entirely my fault," said Agnes. "I was standing in your way." They looked at each other. The woman was perhaps 55, compact and practical, with the outdoor complexion of someone who spends most of their working life in a building that is never quite warm enough. Her hair had been reddish-brown and was going grey at the temples. The overall impression was still warm and auburn rather than grey. She wore a dark blue working dress and sensible boots, and she carried the bucket and the keys with the ease of someone who has been carrying things for a long time and no longer notices the weight. Her hands were strong, the hands of someone whose work is never entirely finished. "You'll be Agnes Hartley," said the woman. "Ellen Hartley's daughter. Come back to sort the cottage." "I am," said Agnes. "And you are—" "Ruth Carey. I teach here." A brief pause, the flatness of a fact stated many times. "For another 3 weeks." Agnes looked at the school building. "I heard the school is to close." "At the end of the month," said Ruth. She said it with a quality that was not quite composure, more like someone who has been saying a fact so many times that they have worn the feeling thin without removing it entirely. "The county board decided. Not enough children. They'll go to Bury." She looked at the bucket in her hand as though she had forgotten it was there. "I'm sorry about your mother. She was well liked in the village." "Thank you," said Agnes. "I didn't know her well enough. That is, I knew her. But I think there was more to know than I gave myself the chance to find out." Ruth looked at her steadily. It was the look Agnes recognized with a small private shock of a teacher who has been given an interesting answer when she expected a polite one. "Come in," said Ruth, "when you want to. The school is open in the evenings, the reading room. You'll be welcome." She went around the side of the building. Agnes stood at the gate for a moment longer, looking at the school, at the bell above the door, at the lamp not yet lit. 3 weeks. The cottage required 3 kinds of attention: practical, emotional, and something between the two that did not have a clean name. Agnes had been a practical person all her life and began with the practical. The kitchen was manageable. Her mother had been a tidy woman of limited possessions who kept what was useful and disposed of what was not. The kitchen required an afternoon and a trip to Mrs. Bowes to establish what could be given to whom in the village, and when that was settled, it was settled. The bedroom was harder, not because her mother had been a person of sentiment. She had not been outwardly, but because the objects in the bedroom were the objects of a life lived in a particular way, and Agnes found, handling them, that she had not known as much about that way as she had believed. Her mother's dresses, 5 of them, plain and well kept. The Sunday one, a dark blue with a collar of good lace that Agnes did not remember her wearing. Her mother's Bible, worn at the spine from use. This surprised her. Her mother had not appeared, to Agnes's recollection, especially religious. The worn spine implied a private faith Agnes had not known about, or a habit of reading that Agnes had not witnessed. Her mother's hairbrush, silver-backed, a gift from someone whose initials were engraved on the reverse, E.H. from W.C., 1871. Who W.C. had been, Agnes did not know, and would now never know. She set the hairbrush aside to take with her when she went back to London. At the bottom of the wardrobe, beneath the Sunday dress and a blanket of good Welsh wool and a box of shoe leather and tins of polish, she found a trunk. The trunk was not large. It was locked. The key was in the pot on the kitchen shelf where her mother had always kept keys. She opened it after supper by the front room fire, with her tea cooling beside her. The contents were a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, a school exercise book, hard-bound, its cover worn, its pages dense with writing, in a hand she recognized as her mother's, but different from any writing of her mother's she had seen, slower, more deliberate, the careful penmanship of someone in the process of learning, rather than the handwriting of someone who already knew. A certificate from the Thornfield village school, dated the 9th of June, 1868, certifying that Mrs. Eleanor Hartley had satisfactorily completed the course of adult reading and writing instruction, and a small pressed flower, a sprig of lavender, still faintly fragrant. Agnes sat by the fire for a very long time before she touched any of it again. She read everything twice before she allowed herself to think about what it meant. The certificate first, the 9th of June, 1868. Her mother would have been 55. Agnes herself had already been in London for 17 years by then. Gone at 18, gone to teacher training college, gone to teach, gone to build a life in the city while her mother was here, in this cottage, walking to this school in the evenings. 3 times a week. Agnes worked out the arithmetic almost without meaning to. The school teacher's reflex. If her mother had begun in September 1867, given the certificate was June 1868, then she had attended for approximately 8 months, perhaps 100 sessions, 100 evenings sitting in that schoolroom, learning to make letters into words, learning at 55, the thing that Agnes had spent her entire career teaching children at 5 and 6 and 7, learning it quietly in the evenings, without telling anyone. The letters next. The bundle was tied with ribbon, and within it she found 12 letters, each in the same careful, uncertain hand, dated from October 1867 to May 1868. They were not letters in the sense of correspondence. They were the written record of a woman practicing, teaching herself to write by the act of writing, with nothing to say except the evidence of her own improving hand. October the 1st. I am writing this down because I can. Miss Pearson said to practice at home. I am writing slowly. It is very hard to make the letters the same, twice. October the 14th. I wrote a whole sentence today, and Miss Pearson said it was good. I do not know yet if it is good. I know that I wrote it. That is something. November the 2nd. I read the front page of the newspaper today, and Thomas was sitting by the fire and did not know. Agnes put the letters down and pressed both hands to her face and sat very still. She had taught reading for 40 years. She had stood at the front of classrooms and believed she understood what it meant to learn to read. She had watched children struggle with it and break through it and find on the other side a world they had not known was there. She had never, in 40 years, thought about what it had cost her mother to sit in that schoolroom at 55. She had not asked. She had been a teacher of children and a daughter and a professional and a great many other things, and she had never asked her mother a single real question about the interior of her mother's life. The certificate was dated 1868. Agnes had left for London in 1850. She had been gone for 18 years when her mother started the classes. 18 years, and she had not known, and her mother had not told her, and she had not asked. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the narrow bedroom that had been her mother's bedroom and looked at the ceiling, the same ceiling she had looked at as a girl visiting, the same damp mark in the east corner that had always, as a child, resembled a map of somewhere she had not been. She thought about her mother, about a woman who had married at 20 in this village, to a man who was decent and hard-working and entirely certain of his own limitations, who had kept this cottage for 50 years and kept it well, who had raised Agnes and sent her to teacher training college, and never, by word or manner, suggested that she herself might have wanted something beyond the borders of this village, who had, in the autumn of 1867, when Agnes had been in London for 17 years, walked in the dark to the village school 3 times a week and taught herself to read, and had not told anyone. Agnes lay in the dark and thought about that silence. The practical reasons first. Her mother had married a man who held particular opinions about the proper order of things, and those opinions would not have accommodated his wife attending school. The social reasons. The village would have had things to say. The private reasons, which Agnes could only guess at. The particular pride of someone who intends to keep a thing entirely their own. Then, very quietly, so that she had to hold her breath to be sure she was hearing it, the school bell. 1 stroke, clear and brief and old. The sound of old bronze that has been rung many thousands of times and carries in its tone the memory of all of them. It was not the hour. It was too irregular for a clock. Someone had rung it once. Agnes lay in the narrow bed and listened to the silence after the bell and thought about Ruth Carey, who taught there for another 3 weeks, about her mother, who had learned there in secret 50 years ago, about what it meant that the school was to close. She was not, she thought, going to be able to stay here for a fortnight and sort the cottage and go back to Islington and leave all of this alone. She had known it in a partial and deniable way since she found the certificate. She knew it properly now. She was going to go and see Ruth Carey tomorrow, and she was going to take the certificate with her. October in Suffolk wakes early and grey, and then slowly persuades itself toward colour. By 9 in the morning, there was a pale gold light moving in from the east, low and sideways, as October light always is, that found the flint in the cottage walls and the flint in the church tower, and set it briefly sparkling, as if the village had remembered something. Agnes walked. She needed to walk before she did anything else. It had always been her way, in London as here, to think with her feet. She went north along Fen Lane past the church and into the field path that ran along the river, the little Ouse reduced now to a mild and thoughtful stream between its banks of sedge and alder. The fields on either side were ploughed and dark. The sky above them was the pale blue of early October, not the deep blue of summer, but something more considered, as though the sky too had been thinking things over. She had been a city person for 49 years. She had lived in 3 cities. She had walked in parks and along embankments and through market streets, and all of it had been fine, good even, the texture of a life she had chosen. But this flat particular landscape, this smell of turned earth and river water, and the particular Suffolk quality of light that made everything look as though it were slightly further away than it actually was. This had been the landscape in which her body had been formed. It received her now the way a body receives a remembered posture. Something in her spine, she thought, had been waiting to be straight in this particular way for 49 years. She walked for an hour and came back through the village. Mrs. Bowes at the post office nodded. The baker's boy nodded. A man she did not recognize mending the churchyard gate nodded. The village's way of acknowledgement, the nod that meant I see you and I have noted your presence and I have decided to allow it, came back to her as naturally as the landscape. At the school gate she paused. The morning bell had rung while she was walking, carrying faintly over the flat country. 8 rings for 8 o'clock, the same bronze voice. She heard, beneath it, the sound of children's voices from behind the flint wall. Young voices, a handful of them. She stood and listened to the sound of school going on, and felt something she could not cleanly name. She knocked at the schoolhouse cottage door at 10:30, when the children would be at their morning work, and Ruth would have a brief interval. Ruth opened the door almost immediately, as though she had been expecting someone, probably only the postman. She looked at Agnes and then at the certificate Agnes was holding, and said, with the directness of a woman who does not believe in preamble, "Come in." The schoolhouse cottage was the school building's attached dwelling, modestly proportioned but well built, and Ruth had made it a home of a particular kind, entirely functional and very alive. Books everywhere, in shelves, on surfaces, in stacks on the floor with the studied disorder of someone who reads constantly and shelves occasionally. A large kitchen table that clearly served as desk, dining table, and workshop simultaneously. A range in good operation. School papers on one end of the table, a teapot on the other, and between them a careful demarcation. "Sit down," said Ruth. "I'll put the kettle on. Is that what I think it is?" "It depends what you think it is," said Agnes. Ruth looked at the certificate over her shoulder as she filled the kettle. "That's a completion certificate from this school. It's the format Miss Pearson used. She was the teacher here before Mr. Aldridge, who was before me." She turned. "Who is Eleanor Hartley?" "My mother," said Agnes. "I found it last night at the bottom of a trunk. With 12 letters she had written to herself between October 1867 and May 1868, practicing her writing. She set the certificate on the table between them. She learned to read here, in the evenings, in secret. She was 55 years old, and she told no one." Ruth stood very still for a moment. Then she put the kettle on the range and sat down across from Agnes and looked at the certificate. "Miss Pearson ran evening classes from 1865 to 1872, she said. "I found references to them in the school records. I did not know who attended. The records are not complete." "Is the ledger still here?" asked Agnes. Ruth looked at her. "Yes," she said. "The ledger is still here." The kettle began to sing. Outside the schoolhouse cottage window, on the other side of the wall, the faint sound of children reciting something in unison. A multiplication table, Agnes thought, from the rhythm of it. The sound of ordinary morning school going on, exactly as it had always gone on for the last time. The children's lesson had resumed. Ruth's assistant, a young woman of 20 called Mary, who came from Bury 3 times a week, was in charge, and Ruth took Agnes through the door between the cottage and the school. The schoolroom was a single large room. Agnes knew it precisely, had spent her career in rooms very like it. High windows set too high for children to see out of. Dark wainscoting up to shoulder height. Above it, whitewashed walls on which were pinned children's drawings, 12 of them, the current roll, ranging from 5 to 11. A pot of chrysanthemums on the windowsill. A globe on the teacher's desk, old and slightly inaccurate, in ways Agnes could see from across the room. A long slate board, still bearing the chalk residue of this morning's arithmetic. And above the far door, the school's founding inscription on a board of pale wood, Thornfield Village School, established 1847, for the children of this parish. Agnes walked slowly around the room. The children's drawings were autumn scenes, the children having been sent out last Friday to observe the horse chestnuts, and then brought in to draw what they had seen. Some drawings better than others, all sincere. In the work of the older children, she recognized the particular quality that appears when children are regularly encouraged to look carefully at the world and then say honestly what they see. This was, she knew immediately, Ruth's doing. "How many children?" she asked. 12 now. "We had 23 5 years ago. The young families are leaving. There is no work here anymore. The farms have mechanized. People go to Bury or Ipswich." Ruth straightened one of the drawings on the wall, though it did not need straightening. "The county board says 12 is not viable. The threshold is 15. Agnes looked at the globe. "How long have you been here?" 22 years. I came when I was 33. "Why here?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I needed to be somewhere," she said. It was not the complete answer, but it was the honest one, and Agnes did not press it. She looked up at the inscription above the door. "For the children of this parish." The board was old and the paint was faded, but the words were clear. She thought about the ledger, about her mother's name, which she was now almost certain was in it. They went back to the kitchen for their tea, which had been keeping warm on the range. The decision had come in February. A letter from the county board, formal and regretful and final. 12 pupils below the viability threshold of 15. A larger school with better resources at Bury St. Edmunds. The children could be conveyed by the new carrier service on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Ruth had written back. She had sent pupil records and parish records and a letter from the vicar. She had appeared before the county board in March and spoken for 20 minutes about what the school provided beyond instruction: the reading room, the evening sessions for adults, the single social institution in the village that was neither the church nor the pub. The board had been sympathetic. The decision had stood. "The evening reading room," said Agnes. "You kept that going?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday evening. 8 women, sometimes 10. We read aloud, a novel, usually, sometimes poetry, sometimes newspapers." Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. Miss Pearson did the same. Different books, the same principle. She ran it for 7 years. "And when the school closes," Ruth looked at her cup, "I lose the schoolhouse cottage as well. The building will be used for storage, the county says. Grain or equipment." A pause. "I have a sister in Norwich who has offered me a room." Agnes looked at her steadily. "But you don't want to go to Norwich?" "No," said Ruth simply. "I do not want to go to Norwich." She looked up. "What was your mother's name? Her first name?" "Eleanor," said Agnes. "Eleanor Hartley, née Cooper." Ruth rose and went to the bookshelf that occupied one entire wall of the kitchen. A row of ledgers, old, their spines labelled in careful archivist's hand. She pulled one down. 1865 to 1875, she said, setting it on the table. Miss Pearson's years. She opened it. The ledger was large and ruled and smelled of the particular dust of things kept very carefully for a very long time. Ruth opened it to the index at the back, names, dates, a record of every pupil who had attended the school and every adult who had attended Miss Pearson's evening classes. She turned to E. Eleanor Hartley, September 1867 to June 1868. Evening class, adult literacy. Attendance, regular. Progress, excellent. 2 lines. The record of 8 months of her mother's life, her mother's secret, her mother's courage. In 2 lines in a ruled ledger, in a school kitchen, in a village Agnes had left at 18 and not come back to for 49 years. She looked at the 2 lines for a long time. Ruth sat across from her and did not speak, which was the right thing to do. Excellent, said Agnes at last, not quite steadily. Miss Pearson was specific about progress, said Ruth. She wrote one of 3 things: improving, good, or excellent. In this cohort of 11 adults, 3 are marked excellent. She paused. Your mother was one of them. Agnes looked at the names around her mother's. She read them slowly, women's names mostly, with a few men: Mary Fletcher, Sarah Dodd, James Aldgate, Hannah Cooper. Cooper, her mother's maiden name. Hannah Cooper was my mother's sister, Agnes said. My aunt. She died in 1870 when I was already in London. We never had the chance to know each other properly. They came together, said Ruth. Look, the dates are identical. September 1867, both of them. Same evenings, I expect. She looked at the ledger. They came together and told no one. Agnes saw it then, the whole picture of it. 2 sisters, one married and one not, in a village in the 1860s, where neither their husbands' opinions nor their neighbours would have been hospitable. Walking together in the October dark 3 evenings a week to a school that was willing to teach them. Sitting side by side at the same desks where the children sat by day, learning the thing that they had been denied at the age when it would have been given freely. My aunt died in 1870, Agnes said. My mother kept coming alone, for another year, on her own. The range ticked. The October morning went on outside. Through the kitchen window, the flat Suffolk field, the pale sky. She walked back to the cottage slowly, carrying the certificate which Ruth had carefully placed back in her hands. She made a fire in the front room and sat before it and let herself feel what there was to feel, which was considerable and various and not entirely comfortable, but which she had decided at some point in the last hour she was not going to manage or contain. She had been managing and containing things for a long time. She was 67 years old. She could afford, briefly, to stop. Her mother had learned to read at 55, had learned to write, had done it in secret with her sister in the same school where Agnes would sit as a pupil 3 years later and find it effortless. Because it was effortless for a child of 6, as it had not been for a woman of 55 who had never been given the chance. Her mother had watched her learn, had watched her become fluent, then fast, then absorbed, then insatiable, a reader who devoured every book in the village school and had to be sent to the lending library in Bury with a list. Had she known, watching Agnes read, that Agnes would become a teacher? Had it been connected, in some way she had never spoken, to her own night school in 1867? She could not know. Her mother was not here to ask. Agnes thought about all the things her mother had never said. The certificate in the trunk, the letters to herself, practicing handwriting in the evenings. The sister who had come with her and died young. The year her mother had kept going alone after Hannah died. The entire hidden architecture of a woman who had wanted something and had found her way to it quietly, without asking anyone's permission, without making a noise that might be heard. Agnes thought about noise. She had been quiet for a long time herself. Not her mother's kind of quiet. She had had a career and a public role and a classroom where she was never quiet. But a different kind of quiet. The quiet of not saying what she thought about her retirement, about the flat in Islington, about the Sunday telephone calls that covered everything and said nothing, about the life she had arranged very competently and from which, if she was honest, she had been absent for some years. The fire burned. The cottage smelled of her mother. Outside, at the top of the street, the school bell rang 12 times for noon. She went that Tuesday evening. The reading room met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. As Ruth had said, Agnes dressed in her better grey dress and was at the school gate at 7:15. She was not the first. 2 women were already coming through the gate ahead of her, who glanced at her with the assessment of a small community managing a newcomer and offered the guarded but civil nod and went in. The schoolroom in the evening was a different place from the schoolroom in the morning. The children's chairs were arranged in a rough circle around the central space, rather than in rows facing the board. The globe had been moved to the center of the circle. Lamps on the window ledges and on Ruth's desk gave the room a warm amber light that transformed the high windows from daytime blank white into dark rectangles framing the night sky. The slate board had been wiped clean. A fire burned in the small grate at the back of the room. 8 women came, various ages, the youngest perhaps 30, the oldest well past 70, and various characters, most of which Agnes could read from decades of teaching experience within the first few minutes. A farmer's wife, practical and sharp. 2 sisters who finished each other's sentences. An older woman who sat with a stillness that suggested she had been sitting in this room for a long time and had no intention of doing anything differently. A young woman, Lily, as Agnes would later learn, who had the slightly cautious expression of someone not quite sure they had the right to be in a room. Ruth came in with a book and settled into the teacher's chair, which had been brought out to join the circle. She looked at Agnes with a nod that was also a welcome. They read Middlemarch. Ruth read a chapter aloud, then passed the book, and each woman read a passage, some fluently, some slowly, all with attention. Agnes read when the book came to her, and her voice, trained over 40 years to carry a classroom, filled the room easily. Afterward, they talked about what they had read. Agnes sat in the circle and listened, and felt something she had not felt since she retired. Useful. She stayed afterward. The other women dispersed with the warm, brief good nights of people who do this regularly. Ruth made tea and Agnes helped, and they sat at the schoolroom desks, not designed for adults but sufficient, and drank it. Mrs. Aldgate, said Agnes, the older woman, the one who sat very still. Is she connected to the James Aldgate in the 1867 ledger? Ruth looked at her. His daughter-in-law. She married his son. She has been coming to the reading room for 16 years. She can read, obviously. She came originally with her daughter when the daughter was learning. She kept coming, She says she comes for the company and because she likes novels. She comes because this is her room, said Agnes. Yes, I think that is exactly it. Agnes turned her teacup in her hands. The young woman, Lily. She was nervous. She is. Her husband does not know she comes. He is not. Ruth paused. He is not a reader. She tells him she visits her cousin on Tuesday evenings. A quiet pause. She has been coming for 3 months. She is a very good reader, much better than she knows. Agnes thought about her mother, walking in the dark to the school in 1867, telling no one. What do they do? She said carefully. When the school closes. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the circle of chairs, not yet rearranged into rows. I do not know, she said. I have thought about it. I do not have an answer. She met Agnes's eyes. I have thought about Lily particularly. She has found something here. If I go to Norwich. You are not going to Norwich, said Agnes. Ruth looked at her. I do not have a choice. The school closes and the cottage goes with it. Agnes thought about the certificate in the trunk, about her mother walking in the dark, about Eleanor Hartley and Hannah Cooper, side by side in a ruled ledger, 2 lines. Excellent. Perhaps, said Agnes, you do. It was the first time, in 49 years of returning to this village in her mind, that she had found a reason to stay. They walked together the following morning, the Wednesday, which was not a school day for Ruth. Agnes knew the village as it had been, and Ruth knew the village as it was, and together they made a complete account of the place. Agnes showed her the pond at the north end where she had learned, one summer, to catch newts, now reedy and smaller. The field behind the church where the harvest supper had been held every year, a barn that was no longer there, only the footings and a stand of nettles. The cottage where her best childhood friend had lived, now inhabited by new people whose curtains were modern. Ruth showed her the village as it was now, which was smaller and quieter and older in character than the village Agnes remembered. The young families gone to the towns, the older ones staying on in cottages, becoming too large for them. The pub still open, less used. The church full, but with a congregation whose average age climbed each year. There were 60 children in this school when it opened in 1847, said Ruth, pausing at the school gate on their way back. 60, now 12. In another generation, this will be a different kind of village. Retired people from Bury and Ipswich coming for the quiet. That happened to many villages, said Agnes. It will happen to more. Yes, but not all of them had a reading room. Ruth looked at the school. Not all of them had women who came in the evenings for 16 years and found something they needed. Agnes thought about Lily, who told her husband she visited her cousin, about Mrs. Aldgate, who had been coming for 16 years because this was her room, about her mother, who had come in 1867 because somewhere in herself she knew that a life without reading was smaller than it needed to be, and who had decided to do something about it, quietly and without permission. What would you need, said Agnes, to stay in Thornfield and keep the reading room going? Not in the school, the county takes the school, but somewhere else. Your cottage, if you had one. What would it cost for the first year? Ruth was quiet for a moment, working it out. Agnes waited with the patience of a woman who has spent 40 years waiting for answers to form. The evening, after supper at her mother's kitchen table, she had cooked, which surprised her by how naturally it returned, the simple Suffolk cooking of her childhood. Agnes spoke of her mother for the first time honestly, not the version she had been telling, the other version. "I thought I knew her," she said. "I thought she was a village woman, a good woman, but limited. The village was her world. She never left it, never wanted to. She was content." She paused. "I left at 18, and I thought, I am different from her. I went away and became educated and became a teacher, and I thought I was more. In some way, more." Ruth waited. "But she learned to read at 55 in secret, and she did it in the evening dark with her sister, and she kept going after her sister died, and she never told anyone, and she kept excellent notes of every stage in an exercise book at the bottom of a trunk, and she kept the completion certificate for 30 years. Agnes looked at her cup. She was more than I was, in all the ways that actually matter. "Not more," said Ruth carefully. "Different. You learned easily and young, and she learned hard and late. Both things are real." "But I never asked," said Agnes. 40 years of asking other people's children questions, and I never once asked my mother a real question. I assumed I knew the answers." She was quiet for a moment. "I assumed she had nothing to teach me." The kitchen fire ticked. The October night was fully dark outside. "My mother never told me," said Agnes. "I wonder sometimes whether she wanted to, whether she nearly did on some occasions, whether I made it clear somehow, without knowing I was making it clear, that I did not expect anything of particular significance from her." "You were busy," said Ruth. "Yes, I was very busy." Agnes looked at the fire. "Busy is a particular kind of invisible, isn't it? You are present and active and too occupied to look at the thing that's right in front of you." Ruth looked at her steadily. "You are looking at it now," she said. "Yes," said Agnes. "I am. Rather later than I should have. But yes." She reached across the table and picked up the exercise book. Her mother's exercise book. The careful, uncertain letters of a woman teaching herself to write. And held it in both hands, the way one holds something that has suddenly revealed its weight. On one of those evenings, later in the week, over the supper she had been invited to share at the schoolhouse cottage, Ruth cooked with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who treats food as a practical requirement and does it well without fuss. Ruth told her she had been a pupil teacher in Ipswich at 22. She had been good. She had expected to be appointed to a town school in due course, perhaps a better post after that. The gradual career she had earned by the gradual accumulation of being excellent at the work. She had been engaged to a man called William Marsh, a solicitor's clerk, who was kind and interested in her opinions. In 1875, William had died of typhoid fever at the age of 27. He had been dead in a week. Ruth said this without elaborating, in the manner of someone who has had many years to decide what to say about it, and has concluded that the facts are the facts and do not benefit from decoration. "I could not stay in Ipswich," she said. Everything in Ipswich had been arranged around the expectation of something that no longer existed. She passed the bread. "I saw the advertisement for Thornfield in 1877, and I came because it was far from Ipswich and had no associations. I intended to stay a year or two, and stayed 22, and stayed 22. She looked at her plate. "I found, after the first year, that I did not need to leave. The work was real. The children were real. The evening classes were already running. Mr. Aldridge had kept them going after Miss Pearson, and I kept them going after Mr. Aldridge. And the village, she paused. The village does not ask for explanation. It accepted me as the school teacher. That was sufficient. And now the school is closing, said Agnes. And now the school is closing. Ruth refilled the teacups with the decisive movements of a woman who does not allow practical tasks to be interrupted by emotion. And the women who come on Tuesdays and Thursdays will go back to their evenings. A pause. Unless, said Agnes. They looked at each other across the table, the distance between them now so slight as to be navigable. If someone were to take a cottage in the village, said Ruth, a person of modest but stable income could live there, comfortably enough. And the reading room could meet in the cottage kitchen, which would hold 8 women comfortably, 10 at a push. Is this a plan or a wish? Asked Agnes. I don't know yet, said Ruth. It depends on whether the cottage can be afforded. Agnes thought about the trunk in her mother's cottage, about what was in it and what it was worth. The following morning, she asked Ruth about the bell. They had walked out before the school day began. Ruth's habit, Agnes had discovered, was to walk the village perimeter before breakfast. Agnes had been invited to join and had joined. The bell, said Ruth. It was the original, cast in 1847 when the school was built. Mears of Whitechapel. It is stamped in the metal. She said this with the precision of someone who has looked it up. The school has always opened and closed with it. Miss Pearson, Mr. Aldridge, me, every morning, every afternoon, for 52 years. I heard it the first night, said Agnes. Once, late. Ruth was quiet for a moment. I ring it sometimes in the evenings. I know I shouldn't. It is not a school hour, and bells have meanings. But I have a habit of ringing it once, at 10 o'clock, when the reading room is over and the women have gone home. A pause. It means the evening is done, and everyone should be home. No one has ever said anything about it. I think the village understands. Agnes thought about that bell ringing at 10 o'clock on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, about the women walking home through the village dark, hearing one clear note above them, about Lily, who told her husband she visited her cousin. What happens to the bell when the school closes? She asked. County property, said Ruth briefly. It goes with the building. They walked for a moment in silence. I want you to ring it for me, said Agnes. This morning, before the children arrive, I want to hear it properly. Ruth looked at her and then, without asking why, led her to the school door and through it and through the schoolroom and out the other side to the small external ladder that climbed to the bell turret. She climbed up and Agnes stood below in the schoolyard. Ruth reached up and took the bell rope and pulled once, and the bell rang out over the village, deep and clear and bronze, the sound of 52 years of mornings and afternoons, the sound of her mother walking in the dark. She stayed for the morning lessons. She had arrived at 9 with a small tin of shortbread she had made in her mother's kitchen, using her mother's recipe, and Ruth had looked at the tin and then at Agnes and said, You can sit at the back. The 12 children ranged from 5 to 11, and they occupied the school's desks with the various arrangements of the young. The oldest at the back, settled and proprietorial, the youngest at the front, fidgety and alert. The middle ones varied in their attentions, as middle children always are. Agnes sat at the back and watched Ruth teach. It was, she recognized, within 10 minutes. Very good teaching. Not showy. Ruth was not a showy teacher and made no performance of the work. But she was precise. She knew exactly where each child was. She knew which ones needed more time and which ones needed more challenge, and which ones needed to be left alone to find their own way. She moved among them with the economy of motion of someone who has no energy to waste because there is always more to be done. At 10 o'clock, Ruth set them to writing practice. Copied the sentence on the board twice, attending to the letters, and came to sit beside Agnes at the back. "You're good," said Agnes quietly. "Yes," said Ruth simply. "I know." Agnes looked at the children's heads bent over their slates. "William," she said. The small boy 2 rows ahead, 6 years old, left-handed, making the concentrated face of a child for whom writing was still entirely effortful. "He's going to be all right." Ruth looked at him. "He's going to be more than all right. He reads better than the 9-year-olds already. He just needs time with the writing." A pause. "He'll go to Bury at the end of the month. New teacher, new school, 23 children instead of 12. "But you won't know," said Agnes. "No," said Ruth. "I won't know." Agnes looked at the drawings on the wall. 12 autumn scenes, 12 particular children's ways of seeing a horse-chestnut tree. She thought about all the children she had taught, whom she had not seen to the end of their story. That was teaching. You gave what you could, and you did not always know, but you tried to give in a place that could hold them long enough for the giving to matter. That was the thing the county board had not been able to measure. Ruth brought out the full set of school records on a rainy afternoon. There were 12 volumes, one for each decade since 1847, plus the partial volume for the 1890s. She and Agnes sat at the large schoolroom table, each with a volume, and spent 2 hours going through them. The records were meticulous. Each child enrolled, their age, their parish, their father's occupation, notes on progress and attendance, their annual inspection reports, and in the volumes covering Miss Pearson's tenure, the separate records of the evening classes, the adult pupils, their progress, their attendance. There were 43 adult pupils over the 7 years Miss Pearson ran the classes, said Ruth, having counted. 31 women, 12 men. The women were largely the wives and daughters of labourers and small farmers. The men were labourers who had come from elsewhere and had not been schooled. Agnes looked at the names. 31 women. She thought about what it had required for each of them to come. The explanations given or not given. The husbands informed or not. The evenings arranged. The work set aside. The particular courage of someone who decides in the middle of a life that they are not yet finished learning. Miss Pearson, she said, what became of her? She left in 1872 to marry a clergyman in Norfolk. She was 37. Ruth looked at the record. I have sometimes thought about her, whether she knew what she was doing, whether she understood that these 43 people and their children and their children's children were going to carry what she gave them. You never know, as a teacher, said Agnes. You rarely see the end of what you began. She thought about her mother, about the 2 lines in the ledger, about the certificate kept at the bottom of a trunk for 30 years, which her mother had never mentioned, and which had been, Agnes now understood, among the most important things her mother had ever possessed. Evidence, proof of something she had done and done well. I should like, Agnes said carefully, to give something, before the school closes, something that acknowledges these 43 people. My mother, my aunt, what Miss Pearson built here. She touched the ledger. An evening, all of them, anyone in the village who wants to come. And we read the names aloud. We say them. We let them be heard. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. Yes, let's do that. They sat for a moment with the records between them and the rain on the windows, and the school very quiet around them, holding its own history like a library. On a rainy afternoon, she wrote a letter. She wrote it at her mother's kitchen table, the same table at which her mother had presumably eaten her meals for 50 years, the same worn wood under her hands, the lamp throwing the same quality of light that her mother's lamp had thrown. She used her mother's pen, which she had found in the kitchen drawer, well kept and still good. She wrote to her daughter in Edinburgh. Her name was Clara. She was 38 years old and a doctor, which Agnes had always regarded with profound respect and never quite said so. There was so much she was coming to understand that she had never quite said in the general rush and competent management of her life. She wrote, I have been here a week, and I am not the same person who arrived, not because of any dramatic event, because I have found something at the bottom of a trunk that I should have looked for before. I will tell you the full story when I see you. But I want to say now, and I am sorry it has taken me so long to say it, that I have thought about you often this week, about what it cost you to become a doctor in 1880, and what you did not say about that cost, and what I did not ask. Your grandmother would have understood. She was braver than either of us knew. She paused. Then she wrote, Come and visit me in December. I will be at the Islington flat. I want to hear what you actually think about things. I have been asking children questions for 40 years. I should like, before I am too much older, to ask yours. She sealed the letter. Then she wrote a second one, shorter, to her son in Bristol. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of her mother's cottage and looked at the 2 sealed envelopes and thought about all the letters that had not been written and the exercise book at the bottom of the trunk and her mother practicing sentences in the October dark. She had been given a great deal to think about in 1 week. She was grateful for it, in the particular way one is grateful for difficult gifts, the gratitude that comes not from comfort, but from having been shown something one needed to see. She walked to the estate agent in the next village one clear morning, 3 miles by carrier's cart, 3 miles back, and asked about the Fen Lane cottage Ruth had mentioned, the one behind the church, available to let. The estate agent was a man of 40 who received her inquiry with the mild surprise of someone not accustomed to women of 67 asking efficient questions about property. She asked the questions nonetheless. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, a parlour, a kitchen with a range, a garden, and a rent that was, given her mother's small legacy, which she had just established, was rather less small than she had expected, entirely manageable for several years. For a friend, she told the agent, which was not untrue. A woman who intends to remain in the village and will be an excellent long-term tenant. She took the letting papers and walked back to the carrier's cart and was in Thornfield by 11. She had not, she thought, made a decision exactly. She had made a number of smaller decisions, to look, to inquire, to find out what was possible, and the decisions had assembled themselves into something that felt, on the carrier's cart in the October morning, very like a plan. She was 67 years old and retired, and her children lived in Edinburgh and Bristol, and the flat in Islington was small and sufficient, and she had 4 walls and a shelf of good books, and no reason outside herself to do anything at all with the next 20 years except manage what she had. Her mother had been 55 when she walked to the school in the dark. Agnes sat on the carrier's cart in the October morning, the letting papers in her bag, and looked at the flat Suffolk fields, and felt in some region of herself she had thought had gone quiet, a very particular kind of alive. She was going to fund the first year, Ruth's cottage, in her mother's name, Agnes Hartley's reading room. It was the right use of the money. It was, in fact, the only right use she could imagine for it. She told Ruth at the schoolhouse kitchen table, over the tea that had by now become a daily fixture. She laid the letting papers on the table. Ruth looked at them. She read the address. Fen Lane Cottage, Thornfield, 2 bedrooms, available the 1st of November. She looked at the rent. She looked up at Agnes. "You spoke to the estate agent," she said. "I went this morning. He was perfectly sensible about it." Agnes folded her hands on the table. "The rent is manageable on the income I mentioned, for at least 2 years. After that, it would depend on whether 1 or 2 other sources had by then materialized, which seems to me a reasonable expectation." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the letting papers and then out the window and then back at Agnes. "You are proposing," she said carefully, "to fund my rent in the village." "I am proposing," said Agnes, "to make use of my mother's money to continue the work my mother participated in. That is not charity. That is a sensible use of a resource in a way that respects its origin." She paused. "The reading room is to be named for my mother, Agnes Hartley's reading room. It will meet in your kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, as it always has, except in a different kitchen. I will return next autumn, if I can, for a week." Ruth looked at her. "Agnes," she said. "I know," said Agnes. "Don't thank me. I am doing this for my mother, and to some extent for myself, and only then for you." Ruth looked at the letting papers for a long moment. She picked them up. She held them with the careful attention of a woman handling something valuable, not because they were paper, but because of what they represented. She had been a school teacher in Thornfield for 22 years, and she had not, in 22 years, imagined staying as anything other than the school teacher. Now she was being offered a different way of being here. Not an ending, a continuation in a different form. She placed the papers flat on the table with the decision of someone setting something down firmly. "The kitchen is large enough for 8 women comfortably," she said. 10 at a push. "Yes," said Agnes. "The range is good. I would need a few more chairs." "Yes, yes," said Ruth. The Thursday before the end of term, Agnes had been in Thornfield for 10 days. She had settled the cottage, made her decisions, written her letters, helped with the school records. She had walked every field path she remembered, and several she did not. She had eaten at her mother's kitchen table every evening and felt each evening a little more of the specific peace that comes when a complicated feeling is finally given the room it requires. The reading room that Thursday had more women than usual, 11, when 8 was the usual. Agnes counted them as they came in, the teacher's reflex, and watched their faces. The regulars, Mrs. Aldgate in her usual seat, still and authoritative. The two sisters, the young farmer's wife, Lily, who was becoming, over the evenings Agnes had now witnessed, perceptibly more settled in the room, the cautious expression softening, the body beginning to occupy the chair rather than hover at its edge. The new ones, a woman Agnes did not know who turned out to be the wife of the new schoolmaster, who would arrive from Bury in November. A woman of about 40, who introduced herself as Ruth's cousin, apparently in the village for the week, and sitting in the corner with the self-contained dignity of someone who has decided a thing and is acting on it. Old Mrs. Truell from the farm at the edge of the village, 79 years old, who had never come before. Agnes caught Ruth's eye across the room. Ruth raised her eyebrows once. She had not expected Mrs. Truell either. They read that evening from the last chapters of Middlemarch, which they had been working through for 3 months and were close to finishing. The room was warmer than usual, physically and otherwise. Something had altered in it, not dramatically, but something had shifted. Agnes felt it, and she thought Ruth felt it too, and she thought, watching Mrs. Aldgate's still face and Lily's slightly more settled posture, that the women in the room felt it too. At the end, when the chairs were being returned to rows, Mrs. Truell came to Agnes and said, without preamble, "I should have come before. I don't know why I didn't." "You came now," said Agnes. "Yes," said Mrs. Truell. "I suppose I did." Agnes watched the old woman make her way through the school door into the October night, and thought about her mother, and thought, it is never too late. She had not planned to speak, but when the reading was done and the chairs were being rearranged, Ruth said quietly, "Would you like to say something?" Agnes stood. She was a teacher. She had stood in front of people and spoken clearly for 40 years. The technical part was not difficult. What was difficult was the thing she wanted to say, which was complicated and personal and risked being exactly the kind of thing that women of her background did not say in company. She said it anyway. "I came to Thornfield 10 days ago to sort my mother's cottage," she said. "I expected it to take a fortnight. I did not expect to find, at the bottom of a trunk, a completion certificate from this school, dated June the 9th, 1868. I did not expect to find that my mother, Eleanor Hartley, née Cooper, had attended this school's evening classes for 8 months when she was 55 years old, that she had learned to read and write here, in this room, with Miss Pearson, alongside her sister, in secret. The room was very quiet. I did not know my mother had done this. I had already left for London by then, gone at 18 to train as a teacher. In the summer of 1868, I was 35 years old, standing at the front of my own classroom in London, teaching other people's children to read. She paused. My mother was here, the same age I was, learning what I had been given freely, the things she had been denied when she was young. She never told me. I never asked. I think I did not ask because I had decided, without meaning to, that there was nothing to find out, that my mother's life was what it appeared to be. Agnes paused. I was wrong. She looked at the women's faces, at Mrs. Aldgate, who was entirely still, at Lily, whose eyes were bright, at Mrs. Truell in the corner, who was looking at the floor. This room was important to my mother. This school was important to 43 people who came to it in the evenings because they needed something it gave them. It is important to the 11 of you here tonight. She looked at Ruth. It will continue to be important. It will not meet here after the end of the month, but it will meet. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Aldgate, who had not, in 16 years of attending, been given to public expression, said, "Here." It was one word. It was, in the Suffolk way, entirely sufficient. The evening of names was held on the Saturday, 3 days before the end of term. They had spent 2 evenings planning it at the schoolhouse kitchen table. Simple. The school would open its doors at 7. Anyone in the village who wished to come could come. They would read aloud the names of every child who had ever attended the school and every adult who had attended Miss Pearson's evening classes. 43 adult names and the childhood names of 211 children over 52 years. The village came. Not all of it. It was a village that maintained its right not to be compelled, but enough. 38 people, which was most of the permanent residents. They filled the schoolroom with its chairs still in the reading circle and stood along the walls and in the doorway. Ruth read the adult names first, slowly and clearly from the ledger. Each name said once into the quiet. Eleanor Hartley. Progress. Excellent. Agnes sat in the circle and heard her mother's name said aloud in the room where she had learned to read, and felt briefly and completely that everything had been as it should be, and that whatever she had come here to do, she had done it. Then the children's names. Ruth read a year, and Agnes read the next. 211 children over 52 years. The names of people who had been 5 years old in this room, and who are now in their 60s, their 70s, somewhere in England, living the lives that had been, in some part, formed here. When they finished, the room was quiet. After a moment, old Mrs. Truell said, from her place by the wall, "My mother's name was in the second list." Several other voices, and mine, and my sister's, and my grandmother's. They stayed for an hour. Ruth made tea in the schoolhouse kitchen, and they carried it through in cups and stood in the schoolroom and talked, the way people talk when something has just been made real that was previously only true. Agnes stood in the room with her cup and looked at the 12 drawings on the walls and the globe and the founding inscription above the door, "For the children of this parish." And she thought, yes, for the children of this parish, and for the women who came in the evenings, and for Miss Pearson, who ran the classes for 7 years and married her Norfolk clergyman, and presumably never knew what she had left behind. You never know, but you do it anyway. The Sunday after the evening of names was clear and still and cold, the kind of October day that Suffolk produces occasionally as a sort of proof of itself. The sky a deep and serious blue, the light absolutely clear, the fields lying flat and open under it with the particular patience of land that has been farmed for centuries and has learned to wait. Agnes walked further than she had walked any other day. She went north out of the village, along the river path, past the point she had reached before, into the farmland beyond. Larger farms now, consolidated. The farmhouses, many of them empty or used for storage. The landscape changed and not changed. The fields were the same fields. The light was the same light. The flat and patient and enormous Suffolk sky was entirely itself. She walked for 2 hours and arrived at a rise, slight by any standard, but in Suffolk sufficient to qualify as a view, from which she could see, looking south, the whole of Thornfield laid out. The church tower, the school bell, the straggle of cottages, the road leading away toward Bury. She sat on a gate and looked at it. Her village. She had left it and built a life elsewhere, as people do, as she did not regret having done. But she had come back and found that the place had kept something for her, had kept, at the bottom of a trunk in a cottage, she could not now bring herself to sell, the certificate and the exercise book and the letters that told her what her mother had been. She had been given her mother back in the last week of what was supposed to be a fortnight's practical visit. Given her mother back and given, in the same transaction, the knowledge that she was her mother's daughter in ways she had not previously understood. The determination, the quiet action, the willingness to be excellent at something that nobody applauded. She sat on the gate for a long time. The village below was quiet in the Sunday noon. The school bell did not ring on Sundays, but she could see it from here, above the roofline, small and green with age and 52 years of mornings. The last day of term was a Wednesday. Agnes was there when the children arrived in the morning. She had brought, from her mother's kitchen, 12 small gingerbread animals, baked the evening before using her mother's tin cutters, the same ones her mother had used when Agnes was small, one for each child. The children received them with the total and uncomplicated joy of children receiving gingerbread. For the last morning, the school was as it should always be, warm and full and busy. 12 children at their desks, the chalkboard used, the globe consulted, the drawings on the walls. Ruth moved among them with the quiet precision Agnes had come to recognize as the signature of very good teaching, unhurried, attentive, missing nothing. At noon, Ruth rang the bell, 12 rings for noon. Then she paused, and then she rang it 12 more times. The children looked at her. One of the older ones, a girl of 11, solemn and careful, said, "Why did you ring it twice?" "Once for this morning," said Ruth, "and once for all the other mornings." The children looked at this. Agnes thought it was the kind of answer a child stores somewhere useful, to understand later. They had their noon meal together. Ruth had made bread. Agnes had contributed potatoes. Mary, the assistant, had brought a pie. The children were noisy and happy and entirely themselves. Agnes sat at the end of the table and ate and listened and thought, this is what a school is, and it will not stop being this simply because a building closes. The school is in the teaching. The school is in what Ruth Carey gave these 12 children in 22 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, and every time someone found something in this room they had not known was waiting for them. The parents arrived one by one. Ruth shook each child's hand with a particular word for each, something specific, something observed. The last child, William, 6 years old, left-handed, shook Ruth's hand and then, apparently on impulse, hugged her around the middle and ran out the door. The schoolroom was empty. Agnes and Ruth stood in it for a moment, in the silence. She spent the last full afternoon at her mother's cottage, completing what needed completing. The furniture she left. The cottage was to remain in the family, left furnished at a modest rent that would contribute something to the arrangement she had made. The larger things her mother had valued, she had divided. The Bible to Clara, who was the religious one, the hairbrush, W.C., 1871, whoever that had been, some woman of the evening class who had become her mother's friend, to herself. The Welsh wool blanket to a family in the village whose need Ruth had quietly identified. The certificate she took, and the exercise book, and the 12 letters. But at the last, she went back to the front room and took the framed photograph of her mother at 55, sitting at the table with a pen in her hand, looking at the camera with that expression of great attention and something that might have been pride. And she set it back on the mantel. She did not take it. It belonged to this room. It had always belonged to this room, which was why her mother had put it there, and why it had never been mentioned, and why Agnes had not recognized it when she first walked in. Beside the photograph, she placed one other thing, a copy of the completion certificate, which she had asked Ruth to make with careful hand from the original. She placed it in a small frame, plain dark wood, and set it on the mantel beside the photograph. The certificate, the photograph, beside each other on the mantel of number 4, Fen Lane, Thornfield. Agnes stood at the door of the front room and looked at them. There, she said, not to anyone in the room, to her mother, wherever that was. Now anyone who comes in will know. She closed the cottage door and locked it and put the key in her coat pocket. She had one more day. The penultimate evening was quiet and full. Ruth had made a proper supper at the schoolhouse cottage, a stew of the kind that a woman makes when she intends a meal to say something she does not want to say directly. They ate with bread and butter and a glass each of the good Suffolk ale that Ruth kept for occasions she had decided were occasions. They talked about Middlemarch, which the reading room had nearly finished. Ruth had a theory about Dorothea Brooke that Agnes disagreed with, and they debated it with the mild heat of two people who read seriously and are not accustomed to being wrong. Agnes conceded a point. Ruth conceded a point. They arrived at a position that was neither of their original positions and was better than both. This was, Agnes thought, one of the more reliable satisfactions available to the serious reader. The conversation that changes what you thought you knew. They talked about London, Agnes's London, which Ruth had never lived in. About Edinburgh, where Clara was building the life of a doctor in a city that had been slow to make room for her. About what it cost, Agnes said, to be excellent at something the world has not yet decided it wants you to be excellent at. About the women who came to the reading room and what it gave them that no other institution in the village gave. Clara is coming in December, Agnes said. My daughter. Ruth looked up. You wrote to her. I wrote to both of them. The letters I should have written 10 years ago. Agnes looked at her glass. Better late. Always better late, said Ruth. They sat by the schoolhouse fire until the clock said 10. Ruth rose and went to the school door and opened it, and from the kitchen Agnes heard her climbing the ladder to the bell turret. One ring, the sound of old bronze over the quiet village, over the stubble fields and the dark river and the church tower and the empty schoolroom with its drawings still on the walls. Agnes sat by the fire and listened to it fade. Tomorrow she would go home. She would go home, and she would write to Ruth, starting the day after tomorrow, because she had a great deal to say. And she had the key to the cottage in her coat pocket, and she intended to use it. On the last morning, before she packed, Agnes went to the school. Ruth was there, as she had been every morning, but doing something different, removing the children's drawings from the walls. She did it carefully, rolling each one and placing it in a cylinder of card, writing each child's name on the outside. For them to have, she said. I'll send them to Bury before the end of the week. Agnes helped. They worked around the room, taking down the 12 drawings in the October morning light, rolling them carefully, labeling them. The walls grew bare. Without the drawings, the room looked more like what it was going to become. When the drawings were packed, Ruth brought out a sheet of good paper and a pen. We should write something, she said, on the wall, before they whitewash it. Agnes took the pen. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote in her teacher's hand, large and clear. This school was built in 1847 for the children of this parish. It was also for 7 years and more for the women and men of this village who came in the evenings to learn what they had not been given when they were young. Their names are in a ledger in the schoolhouse cottage. They came in the dark. They were excellent. Below, she wrote the date, October 1899. She offered the pen to Ruth. Ruth wrote, beneath Agnes's words, the reading room continues. Eleanor Hartley's reading room. Fen Lane Cottage, Thornfield. Tuesday and Thursday evenings. All welcome. They looked at the wall. Someone will whitewash it, said Ruth. Someone will, said Agnes. In the meantime, it's there. She gave the pen back to Ruth. Ruth capped it with the decisive movement of a task completed. They stood in the emptied room together for a moment. No drawings. The globe on the teacher's desk. The founding inscription above the door. For the children of this parish. The words Agnes and Ruth had written, visible in the October morning light. There. Now it was said. Now it was on the wall. She packed with the care of someone who knows she is taking more than she arrived with. The practical items first. Her dresses, her nightgowns, her boots, her books, her mother's hairbrush, the small sprig of lavender she had found pressed in the trunk, which she wrapped in paper, the exercise book, the 12 letters, the certificate in its original frame, then the less practical items, which she counted as she packed them, the knowledge of what her mother had been, the knowledge that 43 people had come to this school in the evenings and been given something they had not had before, the knowledge that the reading room would continue in a cottage kitchen a quarter-mile from this one, on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, with a lamp in the window, the knowledge that Lily would keep coming, and that this mattered, and that she knew it mattered, the knowledge that she had been in 10 days more alive than she had been in 2 years of managed retirement. She brought her case downstairs and set it at the bottom of the stair and stood for a moment in the front room. The mantle, the certificate, and the photograph, side by side. The fire laid and ready for whoever came next to light it. The horsehair sofa, the wooden chairs, the braided rug. Her mother's room, her mother's things. She had not decided entirely what to do with the cottage. She had decided not to sell it. Beyond that, she was leaving the question open. An open question was, she had learned this week, considerably more useful than a closed one. She put on her coat. She picked up her case. She went out the black door and locked it and put the key in her coat pocket. The key to a house she intended to return to. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly the right thing to carry. She walked up Fen Lane toward the school. She walked the village for the last time with the attention of someone who is storing something carefully. The church first. She went in. She had not been inside since arriving, which she now thought was an omission. The interior was what a Suffolk church interior is, old and plain and cold, and full of the accumulated silence of many people over many centuries, asking the same questions in the same stone room. She sat in a pew for 10 minutes. She did not pray exactly. She sat. At the back of the church, beside the door, was the memorial board, the usual Victorian listing of the parish's sons who had died in various wars and in various unfortunate ways. Below it, in a newer hand, a smaller board, in memory of those who served this parish in other ways. A school teacher from 1893, 2 church wardens, the name of Miss Emma Pearson, school teacher, 1865 to 1872, whose adult evening classes served 43 parishioners. Someone had known. Someone had put Miss Pearson on the board. Agnes stood and looked at Miss Pearson's name for a moment. A woman who had run the evening classes and married her Norfolk clergyman and gone away and presumably never known that one of her 43 pupils had kept her certificate at the bottom of a trunk for 30 years, who had done the work without knowing the end of it. She went out of the church and down the main street. Mrs. Bowes at the post office waved from behind the glass. 2 children on the green stopped to look at her with the mild interest of children, for whom departure is primarily interesting rather than sad. At the school gate, she stopped one last time. The bell above the turret, the window dark, the flint wall. She laid her hand briefly on the gatepost. "Thank you," she said, to the school, or to the village, or to her mother, or to all 3, which were, she thought, not entirely separable. "Thank you." She walked on. She had asked Ruth the address of the Fen Lane cottage, the one she had let, and she went there before she went to the school for her final goodbye. The cottage was a 5-minute walk from her mother's cottage, down a lane she had not previously taken, the lane of older cottages, lower built, closer to the fields. She stood at its gate and looked at it. 2 bedrooms, a parlour and a kitchen, a range, a garden in the autumn state that all gardens arrive at eventually, and from which all gardens return. A lamp was not lit in the window. It was morning, and there was no need. But she could see, in her mind, the Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the lamp lit, the kitchen with its 8 or 10 chairs, the women coming down the lane in the October or November dark, Eleanor Hartley's reading room. Her mother had walked in the dark to something like this. The something had been important. The reading room would be important. The chain of quiet women doing necessary things in ordinary rooms in the dark. It did not break. It was still going. Agnes stood at the gate of Ruth's new cottage for a moment. Then she opened it and went up the path and knocked on the front door. No one answered. The cottage was empty. Ruth would move in the 1st of November, a week from now. Agnes knocked anyway. It was a way of saying, I know you are coming. You are expected. This is your door. She went back down the path. She latched the gate behind her. Old iron, the same stiff resistance as every garden gate she had opened this week, the particular sound. And she walked toward the school for the last time. And she thought about her mother. And she thought about Ruth. And she thought about Lily, who would come here on Thursday evenings and find what she had been looking for. And she thought, good, very good. This is how things go on. Ruth was waiting at the school gate with a small parcel. From the school kitchen, she said. There were apples, and I made something for the train. Agnes took the parcel. It was warm slightly. Apple cake, she suspected, from the smell of it. She held it carefully. They stood at the gate that she had stood at in various states of feeling for 10 days. Next autumn, said Agnes. September or October. I will come back. I will be here, said Ruth. The reading room will be running by then. It will be running by December, said Ruth. I have spoken to Mrs. Aldgate, who has agreed to host the first evening at her cottage in the event that I am not yet settled. She has been waiting to be useful in this way for some years. I believe she is pleased. Agnes thought about Mrs. Aldgate. Still authoritative, sitting in her usual chair for 16 years, holding the room by the quality of her attention. She will be magnificent, said Agnes. She will be terrifying, said Ruth. And yes, Agnes laughed, the clear, real laugh of someone who does not laugh often, and therefore, when they laugh, it is entirely genuine. It was not the first time she had laughed this week. She had laughed more in 10 days than in the previous year. Write to me, she said. I will write to you, said Ruth. You should also write to me. I will write more than I have written to anyone in recent years, said Agnes. I have discovered this week that I have rather a great deal to say. Ruth looked at her with the look that Agnes had come to think of as Ruth's most characteristic expression, the direct and careful attention of a woman who has spent 22 years observing what people are actually doing, as opposed to what they appear to be doing. You always had, said Ruth. Agnes took her hand. Ruth's hand was warm and practical and entirely itself. They held hands briefly across the gate, the same iron, the same sound of it. Then Agnes picked up her case and walked up the village street toward the carrier's cart that would take her to the station, and the October morning closed around her, and she walked through it with the particular quality of a woman who knows where she has been and is not yet certain where she is going, but has learned in 10 days in a Suffolk village to consider this not a deficiency, but a door. The train left at 12 minutes past 11. She had caught it with time to spare. She had always been punctual. It was one of her fixed qualities, though she was beginning to understand that some fixed qualities have more to do with habit than with necessity. The train ran west and then northwest, back toward London, through the fields she had walked and the landscape she had been formed by, and which had, in 10 days, returned to her something she had not known she was missing. She watched it go past the window, the flat fields, the wide sky, the churches at intervals, their towers the only verticals in a landscape that preferred the horizontal. The farmhouses behind their lines of elm, the autumn light that made everything look clear and serious and exactly what it was. She had the warm parcel on her lap. She ate a piece of Ruth's apple cake at 11:30. It was excellent, as she had known it would be, because Ruth brought the same quality to apple cake that she brought to everything: complete attention and no pretension. She thought about the flat in Islington, about what she was going back to, and what, having been away for 10 days and returned with something she had not had before, she was going to do with it. She was going to clear the small bedroom and put a desk in it. She was going to write, not professionally, not for anyone else, but because she had been writing in her mind constantly all week, and had discovered that the thing she had thought was finished was not finished, only interrupted. She was going to write about her mother, about the certificate and the exercise book, about 43 names in a ledger and the woman who ran the classes and the Norfolk clergyman she married. She was going to write to Ruth, starting the day after tomorrow. Clara was coming in December. She was going to ask Clara the real questions. She was 67 years old. She had been, for a number of years, excellent at keeping things going. She was going to be, she thought, as the train ran through the flat October country toward London, excellent at beginning them. She held the empty parcel in her lap. She had eaten the whole cake, which she noted without guilt as evidence of appetite returned, and looked at the last of the Suffolk fields, and felt fully and without management the particular aliveness of a woman who knows exactly why she is who she is. On the first Tuesday of November, at 7:30 in the evening, a lamp was lit in the window of the cottage at Fen Lane, Thornfield. The cottage was small. The kitchen was, as Ruth had estimated, capable of holding 8 women comfortably and 10 at a push. 8 chairs had been arranged loosely around the central space. A fire burned in the kitchen grate. The range was going. The smell of the cottage, new inhabited, Ruth's books already on the shelves, the particular smell of tea and old paper, and someone who reads constantly arriving in a new space and beginning to make it theirs, was the beginning of what, in time, would become the cottage's own smell. The lamp was in the window. This had been agreed. The lamp as the reading room signal, the sign that said, "Open, come in, you are expected." 8 women came, Mrs. Aldgate first, which surprised no one. She took the chair nearest the range, which was her new usual place, and arranged herself in it with the settled authority of a woman returning something to its proper home. She waited with the stillness that was her characteristic quality. Lily came, and she brought her friend, a young woman Agnes had not met, who would be, Ruth had later written to Agnes, the reading room's newest and probably most significant addition. She sat carefully and looked around her with the particular expression of someone who has just walked into a room they needed and did not know existed, and the others, the 2 sisters, the farmer's wife, 2 more regulars, and 1 new face, a woman of 50 who had heard about the reading room from Mrs. Bowes at the post office, and had come because she had always meant to, and had finally decided that meaning to was not the same as going. Ruth settled into her chair with the book, a new novel, something they had not yet read. She looked around the circle at the 8 women. "We'll begin," she said. and the lamp in the window burned its steady light into the November dark, the same lamp that would burn every Tuesday and Thursday for many years to come, in the kitchen of the cottage at Fen Lane, in Eleanor Hartley's reading room, for the women of Thornfield who came in the evenings because they needed something and found in this room, with these women, with these books, that it was there. The flame burned. Ruth began to read. The last of them left at 10:15. Ruth washed the cups herself. She had refused help from several of the women who were not used to leaving cups unwashed in someone else's kitchen, and who required the particular instruction that this was Ruth's kitchen now, and she managed it as she chose. She washed the cups and set them on the shelf, and banked the kitchen fire, and turned the lamp in the window down, though not quite out. She left it burning, as Mrs. Paget had always left the lamp in the window at Wren Cottage, not as a signal to anyone coming in now that the evening was done, but as a habit that had become, over the years of the reading room, a kind of faith. The light kept. Even when the room was empty, the light kept. She sat in the kitchen in the quiet after everyone had gone, the way she had always sat in the school in the quiet after everyone had gone. Not because she had not finished, but because the silence after a room full of people has its own quality, and she had learned to attend to it. The 8 women, Lily's friend, whose name was Joan, who had not opened her mouth during the reading, but who had sat with an absorption that Ruth recognized as someone discovering for the first time that a book can hold you entirely. Mrs. Aldgate, who had come to the reading room for 16 years as though it were her due, because it was. The 2 sisters and the farmer's wife, and the woman of 50 who had finally decided that meaning to was not the same as going. Ruth thought about Agnes, who was in Islington tonight, in the flat she found insufficient. Who was, Ruth was now certain, writing a letter. She thought about Eleanor Hartley, née Cooper, September 1867 to June 1868. Attendance regular, progress excellent, who had walked to this village's school in the October dark with her sister and learned to read and kept the certificate at the bottom of a trunk for 30 years and never said a word about it, and who had, in the end, been found. The lamp in the window burned. Outside, the November night, the flat Suffolk fields, the church tower, the school building dark and quiet at the top of the street, and in the cottage on Fen Lane, the kitchen warm and the cups on the shelf, and the books in their new places on the shelves of Eleanor Hartley's reading room. A lamp that burned because someone had decided it should, and would go on burning and on. If tonight's story helped you drift into rest, you're always welcome here at Soft Sleep Tales. Whenever you need a quiet story, there will always be another waiting for you. Sleep well.